Welcome to tonight's Cataract Surgery Education Evening with the National Eyecare Workstream CFSD, and a special thank you to NHS Education for Scotland and particularly Jane Kyle this evening for their support with hosting tonight's webinar. My name is Helen Court and I work with the National Eyecare Workstream, and it's a real privilege tonight to introduce and to welcome a fantastic lineup of speakers for what I believe will be a very interesting and educational evening. But before I do those welcomes, what I'd like to do first of all is to do a couple of housekeeping slides. So first of all, tonight on your device, dependent on the device you have logged in on, you'll have some kind of meeting toolbar. It may look something like what you can see on the slide. I just want to draw your attention to two particular parts of that. First of all, our speakers tonight are very keen that you ask questions, but due to the large number of people logging on this evening, we're not able to actually open up people's microphones. So if you have a question at any point during the evening, if you can open up the Q&A icon, you'll notice the little picture on the screen says chat, but actually it should be it should say Q&A. That's what to tap on. If you pop your question in there, we're going to have 2 times during the evening where we'll review those questions and get through as many of them as possible. Secondly, we do realise that there are times when we're doing online webinars that we have a few technical issues. A more common one tends to be problems with audio. So if you find yourself in that situation tonight, if you could just go to the 3 little dots on the screen that say more, if you click on those dots, you can then go into a section which will allow you to check, as you can see, device settings, and from device settings, double check that you've got your correct device and speakers. If you're still having problems, the next thing to do, which is generally very effective, is just to leave the meeting using the red leave button and rejoin, and hopefully you'll be sorted. So as I've said, tonight, for any questions, if you could do that through the Teams Q&A section. However, we do have a number of polls this evening that the speakers have embedded into their talks, which will be a great opportunity to have some interaction. Now, if you've got a phone or a device right now, and if you can scan that QR code, you'll be set up for the evening. Alternatively, if you go onto any web browser and type in slido.com, and then at the top put in #cataract, that will also set you up ready for the Slido. What will happen is once that's set up, you don't need to touch your device. As we go through the slides this evening, when a question pops up, a Slido question, that will pop up on your device and you'll be able to take part. If you've not had a chance to get that sorted while I've been speaking, that's not a problem. When the Slido questions come up later, all that information will be on the slides again. So without further ado, as I've said, it's just a great privilege to introduce such a fantastic lineup of speakers. And this evening, we're going to start off with Dr. Janet Pooley, who is the Chief Optometric Advisor at the Scottish Government. Janet's going to give us a quick kind of introduction and give us some context about cataract surgery in Scotland. So I'll pass over to you, Janet.
Great, thanks very much, Helen. So it's great to be speaking to you all tonight, and I guess a lot of you know me as from my role working in Scottish Government and letters that I've been sending out and presentations that I've done over the years. But another part of my job outside the Scottish Government, although working with the Scottish Government, is around the National Eyecare Workstream and looking at the interface between optometry and ophthalmology and supporting patients across the whole of the primary secondary care interface. And so this evening is very much focused on that, and we've got some fantastic speakers, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it very much. And my brief presentation here is just to give you some context into how, as an optometrist, you interact with this whole pathway. So if I can have my next slide, Helen. Thank you. So just to give you a bit of context here, it's about nearly 41,000 surgical procedures in Scotland in 2024, and that's across all our NHS sites. The vast majority of sites do conduct some cataract surgery, but many of you will know that we have some specialist centres which do just cataract surgery, like, for example, the Golden Jubilee, which just does cataract surgery, local anaesthetic cataract surgery. But lots of the units around Scotland do perform this surgery. And the conversion rate from us referring the patient in to the patient being listed for surgery varies quite considerably. And we don't have great data on this, but it's somewhere around 65 to 95% of our referrals convert from us sending a letter in to the patient being listed for cataract surgery. But many of you will be very aware that we are presently having extremely long waits for our cataract surgery. Our patients are waiting a long time. So earlier in this year, the First Minister did announce additional funding, and the funding is for planned care. So that rather than our acute services, the planned care would be something like cataract surgery, and we are hoping to get considerable amounts for ophthalmology, particularly to reduce our waiting lists. And so we're looking to have a dramatic increase in the amount of capacity that we will have across the whole country to conduct cataract surgery. And so hopefully we'll be seeing the waiting list dropping an awful lot over the next year. Right, Helen, if we have the next slide. So it's really key. Optometry plays a really key part. And those of you logging on today will be very aware of what key part you play in supporting people with cataract. And the big thing about cataract is that it's a joint decision. It's very different from a lot of the other referrals that we make, because you're making a joint decision yourself and the patient, deciding on which point at which they require referral. And so you'll probably have been seeing your patient for a long period of time. You'll have been discussing the very early symptoms that they're having with very early cataract. And as their vision decreases and they're starting to struggle, then you're having that conversation over a long period of time. But the key, and I know this is blatantly obvious, but it's the one piece of feedback we often get: you need to make sure when you're making the referral that the patient wants to have surgery. It's very obvious, but sometimes apparently it's missed. So you need to give patients the information they need in order to make an informed decision. So that discussion between yourself and the patient when you're making the referral is really important. And I just wanted to flag to you the opportunity to claim a code 2.9. So this is giving the patient additional information and more time to consider whether they would like surgery, what are the implications, and then you going forward and making that referral. So we can have the next slide, please, Helen. So we've put together, and Helen's been working on this an awful lot, an aid memoir to help you with that code 2.9. So this is where a patient is not sure about whether they want cataract surgery. And this is a discussion that you can have with them to ensure that they know what to expect. And this has been put together by a group of really enthusiastic and supportive consultants and optoms who've put this together to help you. And you can find this aid memoir on the eyes.scot website. The link is there. I had a little bit of trouble finding it, but if you look under the supplementary eye examination section, you should find it quite easily. And I would strongly advise you, if you've got a patient who you're not sure or is not sure about having a referral, then give them the information they need and then contact them again. Either call them in and make another appointment or do a phone consultation and go through these questions. You might have done some of the questions when you saw them in the consulting room, but you might follow up. They might want to have a chat with their families, but just to make sure they're absolutely sure that a cataract referral is what they want and they want cataract surgery. This is really helpful. It's been tested by quite a lot of people and has worked really well. But this gives you the reassurance to make that 2.9 claim. And I was just looking back at some of the data. So we have data from 23-24. Only 16,000 of these claims were made for 2.9s. So I would urge you to really have a good discussion with your patient and considering calling them again, getting them in again, and making that claim. It's there to help you and to help your patient make sure you get them, those patients who want to have surgery, get them on the waiting list. Fantastic. Great, Helen, next slide. So loads of interesting things tonight. I told you it was going to be very short. Scottish Government is coming around in June to do some more presentations. We're travelling around the country, so some information will go out about that soon. Lots of things are changing, and we'd really value your feedback and some presentations, and be good to see you all. So look out for those, but please enjoy the evening. Lots and lots of interesting things. I've been looking through the slides and it looks fascinating, so please enjoy. Thanks ever so much. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks so much, Janet, and thanks for that introduction. It's a real pleasure then to now introduce and formally introduce Dr. John Ellis. John is a highly experienced consultant ophthalmic surgeon working in NHS Tayside and really has pioneered high flow cataract surgery techniques and simultaneous same day cataract surgery across Scotland. So I'm going to pass over to John and we'll go from there, John.
Thanks very much, Helen. That's very kind of you. I'm really conscious that by attending your presence here, all 250 of you or however many are folks, you're giving up a very precious evening, and that's a kind of a pretty sacred trust. So try and use that well. So I think are we going to go to the Slidos first? Is that right, Jane? Just have a couple of questions to see where people feel they're pitched with regard to knowledge on a couple of questions. Let's see. So I've got a couple of questions coming up. Here we go. So if you've already scanned the code, the question's probably on your device already. If not, you can dive in there and start voting. Excellent. Thank you very much. So cataract surgery has been shown to reduce dementia risk by however much. 40 respondents, 48. Very good, very good, very good. Excellent. We're going to do the great reveal of the answer that's evidence-based in the talk, so I'll not answer that. But if you can sort of kind of burn that into your retina, what folks are saying. So the majority, the kind of fashionable answer is 30%, with some less, some more. Now that we're up at 120 respondents, probably peer group pressure is beginning to kick in and people are all going for 30, but that's great. Excellent. Okay. I don't want to cut this short. Anyone else want to vote? So half of folks would say it's a 30% reduction. That's great. When I gave a talk with this slide, I asked everyone to tune out of my talk, ignore what I had to say, use their device for the rest of the talk. See if you can find any other healthcare intervention that reduces the risk of dementia as much as eye surgery, in particular cataract surgery, obviously. Great. Let's move on to the next slide, if that's okay, Jane. ISBCS stands for immediate sequential bilateral cataract. ISBCS surgery in Scotland is suitable for. So what we're driving at here is clearly you would intuitively be aware that not everyone is wise to get both eyes done at the same time. But what kind of proportion could we be hitting if everyone who was eligible was getting it? It's interesting that nobody down the bottom there, 5%, nobody thinks it's as low as 5%. Do you know what Scotland is doing currently? Answer, approximately 4%. And none of you think that's the right number. And just as plot spoiler, oh, 1%, excellent. Just a plot spoiler, you're right. Great. Okay, burn that into your retinas as well. And we're going to move on. And I think I'm going to try and share my screen and take control if that's okay. So thank you very much. Let's see how we get on with that. And we're going to try and keep the audio on with that. That's grand. So if somebody's not muted, could just shout out. You're presumably seeing a cataract, how to solve a public health problem before it's your turn. Yeah,
that's spot on, John. All good.
Thanks, Helen. The actual title is Risk Factors for Surgery in Scotland for both high volume and ISBCS. But I plagiarized from myself. This is an editorial we published last month, I think, in Eye. And really what it gets at is that clearly this is not academic. We're all going to be patients one day. You can't say that of almost anything else, but cataracts are in our future for certain. And I'd like really to start with a story of a politician, an author, and a coffee shop in 1930s Paris. The politician is John Swinney, and the date is the 27th of January. And as Janet hinted, on that day, John Swinney said that Scotland needs more cataracts, and we are going to do 9,500 in Perth, Stracathro, and in Dunfermline. This is not a political comment. This is a matter of public record. The problem with that thing said is that there is no hospital in Perth. It was cancelled by Scottish Government a couple of years ago as a prospect. There is no hospital in Stracathro, and the chief exec of Tayside was as surprised as anybody to hear that announcement. So I put it to you that But that is problematic. And actually, Janet hinted that there's more money coming. That's great, but money alone without a plan doesn't solve things. The next thing is the author. This chap, Dan Davies, wrote this rather superb book called The Unaccountability Machine: Why Big Systems Make Terrible Decisions. And one of the problems with the National Health Service, much as we love it, is that it has become so big that it's not prone to the kind of malleability and the ability to adapt to change that we need it to have. And this is a quote from the book: "The point of the system is what it does. There is, after all, no point in claiming that the purpose of the system is to do what it constantly fails to do." In other words, if you say, well, it's strange that the NHS is not coping with waiting lists or not coping with cataracts, that lament is rather at odds with the purpose of a monolithic organization, which is just to maintain itself. So I lied to you about a cafe in Paris. We're not going to go there. But the point of the 1930s cafes in Paris was that's where the rebels plotted taking over the established order. And I really want to appeal to all 250 of you to become kind of rebels and to try and raise a certain amount of legitimate anger, which could be channeled into productivity to try and change the situation. In one of the Superman movies, Superman he takes Lois Lane up to the clouds at 10,000 feet or whatever it is. So he's trying to tell her to give up being Superman and live a quiet life. And he says to her, "What can you hear?" And she says, "Well, I can't hear anything." And he says, "Well, I can hear that baby whose mother just died, and I can hear that man being mugged." And this is the stack of ISBCS on my secretary's desk. Every single human story is only one A4 paper sheet thick. But if you can hear what they're telling you, that is a catalogue measured in inches of human misery. And I'll give you one example, and you'll all be familiar with the same kind of thing. This is not fictional. An 81-year-old lady said, "I live in a rural location. My husband has terminal cancer. My adult son with Down syndrome lives with us. If I can't drive, I don't know what will become of us." In other words, you don't have to be cataract blind. You just have to have worse than 612. And Scotland is struggling. So here's a question. If you ask in an Ipsos Mori poll, what is the highest priority concern for the population? What do you care about? This is not health questions. This is just what bothers you. And you'll see things like taxes and schools and security and free speech. The number one concern is NHS waiting lists. And it's said that 1 in 7 citizens of the UK is on a waiting list for something. So people are really exercised about this problem. Unfortunately, it wasn't just COVID. The red line is the Scottish RTT guarantee of 18 weeks from referral. That was the case since 2001. And on the whole, this is not ophthalmology, this is everything. The green line, up until 2016, we were kind of hitting the target most of the time. We began to fall off in ophthalmology in Tayside, and a colleague and I went to see both John Swinney and Jason Leach in St Andrew's House. And Jason Leach said to us, well, it was 2018 when we saw him, and he said, well, everybody knew that exactly 10 years after the bankers collapsed, this was going to happen. And of course, the tragedy is we didn't know that. But austerity happened, and then COVID just leveraged a bad situation. This is our data in Tayside, and forgive me for being parochial, but obviously I'm assuming that our story is in microcosm what all of you are experiencing around the nation. So I don't have a pointer. The top continuous purple line rising is the number of cataracts in Tayside, and the years are 2023 to 24. The dotted line is the number waiting between Optom, that's you guys, and a clinic for us to agree and say, yes, indeed, it's a cataract. Now, we got rid of that node. It's a 3-node journey. You guys, then a clinic, then the theatre day, and we moved to a one-stop direct listing, which we'll come on to in a minute. So the dotted line is added to the other numbers. So it's a true waiting list, which is why it's climbing. But our hospital decided to close us for 2 consecutive periods, the October holidays and then the Christmas holidays. And you'll notice the red bars when our eye theatres were shut down to save money, that the numbers climb. When they're not shut down, the red circles indicate we can almost hold the flood steady. We're not regaining, but we are holding it. But every time they shut things down, we lose ground. And we all know what's happened to the Eye Pavilion in Edinburgh. And of course, input and output are just a maths problem. In Tayside, we were doing roughly 72 cataracts a week. We're a bit higher than that now. Now, if you list 72 and you do 72, you're just in steady state. And whatever your waiting list is, if it's thousands, it's going to stay there. Now, if you list 72 and you can do 20 more, then in a 52-week year, you approximately reduce that by 1,000 a year. The 42 is NHS Highland, and the 24, I believe, is Borders. Those are the kind of numbers that people are trying to get through. So if we get ourselves to the position where we think that change is necessary, what happens next is that people love the idea of change, but every change threatens the status quo in some ways that just make people nervous. I think we can all agree that the outcome of cataract surgery is not controversial. We want people to see better, and we want to have as few complications and as few disappointments as possible. And that's really where we go. We probably don't need to be persuaded that cataract surgery is a good thing, but here's the answer to the dementia question. Massive and powerful study, 23,500 person years of follow-up. So patients were recruited over 65 and followed to either dementia or death. And cataract surgery reduced the risk of dementia by 30%, highly statistically significant. The benefit was maintained for up to 10 years. And you can do a sort of napkin, back of the napkin, number needed to treat calculation. And approximately every 69 cataract surgeries we do, probably on this very, very approximate statistic, prevents somebody from dying of dementia in a nursing home. This is one of my colleagues operating. This is the high flow unit. This is not time-lapse photography. This is real. This is edited just to show the instrument exchanges. But when I show that to most ophthalmologists, they're just covetous of that level of kind of flow. The slide on the photograph on the left, on the day when we were running high volume in the 2 theatres, that day we did 51 cataracts in a day, 1 cataract theatre ending 1 hour early, the other on time, 1 ICS, and 4 cases given to a junior. Now, traditionally, the hierarchy of how you need to run things is stacked up this way. The culture is just how we do things here. Team is my guys. Strategy is what we plan to do. And surgeon at the top is me, me, me. And of course, as Sarah Malling, who's from the college and head of training, says, surgeons don't take out cataracts, teams do. And the way to change things is to completely tip it on its head. The surgeon, in a sense, is the least important because he can do nothing unless he has a team or a culture that is supportive. But changing culture is much, much harder than changing individual practice. We had Neil Gray, the health minister for Scotland, come and visit in October of last year. And I showed him this picture and I said, the slide on the list on the right is the high flow theatre. That's my team. And the list on the left is a standard cataract theatre. And I said, if tomorrow my team moved back to doing what's on the left, not one of them would be disciplined, not one of them would have a deduction of pay, and not one of them would have a performance review. In other words, all that activity is just based on a belief that this is what we should be doing. So this is Cataract 1.0. This is the system we had before we innovated with high flow. And I want to talk to you about a couple of these things. If you look at the old Greek philosopher there, it's worth saying that the OECD, 38 member states, produced a report in 2017 that in these countries, this is most of the developed world, 20% of healthcare has no perceived benefit to its recipients. Instead of which, in eye care, in cataract, it's approximately 4,500% return on investment. I want to talk to you about collectivism. That's the Ringelmann picture at the top. And just a quick word about Darth Vader to remind me there's a dark side, and that's Isaac Newton above, to say that for each and every action, there's an equal and opposite criticism. And undoubtedly, when you start changing things, people don't react positively some of the time. So collectivism, we have had from the Scottish Office CFSD, we have had a lot of short life working groups and spin-offs. And I think I've been involved in all of them except the one on the EPR. Helen has been involved and led. And the idea is to try and get a kind of collective response. And I'm not convinced that that is the way most things in life change. Most things change by a strong advocate and a pioneer. But I think it's predicated on a spirit that none of us can change until all of us change. And actually, as professionals, we're often quite nervous about standing out from the herd. This is cataract surgery from one of our nurses had a mother who was a missionary in Africa and had this cine film converted to video. Max Ringelmann produced this theory in 1913 and came up with the term social loafing. And what he found was that if you put one man on a rope and he could pull 85 kilograms. If you put 7 men on the rope, they should pull 595 kilograms, but in fact they pulled 475. And it's an expression of the fact that as teams grow, the relative contribution of each member begins to diminish. And it's not necessarily laziness, it's because people are not sure what their exact contribution um, adds to the whole. And one of the problems with the NHS, it's just so large that unless we can get people ownership of the changes that they're making, they can't really see that their innovation is moving the needle or moving the dial. Another Harvard professor came up with this business idea, disruptive innovation. And up at the top, where private cataract surgery is chasing multifocals and EDOF lenses, what they're trying to do is trying to get the last increment of income from the nth degree of refinement of the IOL. But I think what we need up underneath, when nobody's paying attention, is a grassroots revolution that just says, look, a monofocal lens done competently is the best possible optical result. And when it's my turn, that's what I want. And I think we need to change it that way. We all know the adopters curve from innovators and early adopters, getting it across the chasm to people who are not necessarily fashion-led, but who are very practical-minded, but need the convincing that an early adopter has shown them with considerable evidence that it's worth taking up. And of course, there are people who will be last to adopt. So in Tayside, this is Cataract 2.0. This is what we've been doing. NTC stands for the National Treatment Centre in Perth, and as you've heard, unfortunately, that was cancelled, which means that what we got out of that was a logo, which is very nice. We use 6 Sigma analysis, and we managed to shave off 2 minutes per case, and we do 30 cases a day. So clearly, that's an hour, which is the kind of margins that we're talking about. Top left, ISBCS. We have now done more than 1,200 plus, but it's kind of it's true now to say that at 1,400 or so, we've had 4 patients decline. When we finished the first time, we ask, are you happy for us to go on to the second? I'll show you what the graph, the red and blue lines means in a minute. And I want to talk about the magic source. This is not meant to be read, obviously, but this is 6 Sigma analysis measuring everything we did down to the second and all the stages of operations. And we did one innovation, which managed to reduce the average turnover time from 7 minutes to 4.54, just under 5 minutes per patient. And by shaving off 2 minutes on 30 patients, clearly that's an hour a day, which makes the difference between adding a couple more cases or finishing on time. So who is the beneficiary of all this? Well, I'd like to think it's patients, and I also think it's staff, in the sense that we enjoy the job that we do, and we are making a significant difference. This is a registrar doing a Parkinson's patient under local anesthetic. And I think the trainee benefits. I think they get really good training, and we have no problem in taking on this kind of case, and there's no need for this to be done under general anesthetic. So who wins? There's a 4x4 grid, and clearly one of the boxes is irrelevant. Nobody's going to make a change that's worse for everybody. And there are only 3 other possibilities. It could be better for the patient and worse for our staff, which is very noble, but that's difficult to sustain. Better for the staff, but worse for the patient is clearly immoral, and we want to get it better for both of us, and I think we can. So when we started the innovation, my motto that I said to the nurses repeatedly for 6 months was, I want you to go home having been more busy but less tired. And one of the nurses early on in the Short Life Working Group responded to Catherine Calderwood's question, why do your nurses do more for the same pay and the same working conditions? And the nurse who was leading the work responded by saying that I've had nurses swapping their off duty to come in on the high volume days because they prefer it. So the question is, if you can't increase people's pay and you can't let them go home early, you can pay them in neither time nor money, what is it that makes people do the extra? And you need the confluence of these 3 things. Connection means you need a team that you believe in, who've got your back and you have theirs. Flow means that the day is moving smoothly and you don't have idleness alternating with mad panic. Everything is smooth and you're in flow. The question is, what is in the 3rd circle? And the answer is not something noble like intrinsic reward, but actually it's fun or playfulness, or if you're in California, it would be joy. Now, playfulness is often dismissed as frivolity, but these are some of the 21 synonyms for playfulness. And if you look at some of them, completion, camaraderie, competition. Others include altruism. You would say, well, if you're defining fun that way, then I would agree with you. And actually, one of the things that happens is that people enjoy work and want to turn up to do the job. And I am centrifugal in authority. We give out responsibility to the nursing team and to the clerical teams, and we expect folks to run with it and try not to micromanage. And the result of all this is that one of the registrars who was working with us produced a video. Unfortunately, if it flashed past too quickly, it was the nursing success story. There you can see it again. Although he was working in Canada doing his fellowship, the video was produced in Ninewell, Scotland. And this is just the narrative of his story working with us in Scotland, producing high flow. And he got the kind of equivalent of the ESCRS Oscar for that, which is great. So the definition of a cataract is it's a symptomatic condition. Patients are the best judge of their symptoms, and surgery should improve self-reported visual difficulty. And I think that that would be borne out in the number of patients who want immediate sequential. This was an audit I did of 1 month's clinic in March of 2022. And at that point, the orange is the ISBCS, just under 40% were going for immediate sequential. And you can see the reasons why some people opted for delayed sequential. Actually, not wanting was a very small percent. This is 24 months later, it's 2 years later, and listing just under 60% for immediate sequential. And with regard to Janet's point about the number that we are converting, there's none discharged on that. I'm not saying it's a huge sample, but that is almost 100% conversion. In the editorial that we published, one of the accusations against immediate sequential is that you are delaying having had at least one eye done for some people, whilst others have both. And what we modeled mathematically, the numbers 24 and 50 at the bottom are the approximate time in weeks from referral from the community to the cataract clinic. Our waiting time was 24 weeks at that time. Now, if you had 2 hospitals in a naive population, one starting with delayed sequential, which is conventional, the other red line with immediate sequential, yes, at first, the one eye only population would pull ahead. But what happens once you pass the waiting time to clinic is that second eyes begin to be referred back into the system, and the line slows down. And what this crossing point is, it's approximately twice that time. So you can do the maths for your region. If it's 40 weeks for optom to clinic, then it's 80 weeks to crossing over. So we're now at 112 weeks, and we've long since passed that point. So immediate sequential, because of the economies of scale in theatre, is a much quicker form of surgery and is better for the population as a whole. This is a study from Finland of 56,700 cataracts, and they're charting the rise in immediate sequential from the year 2008 to 2020, and they're hitting 63% immediate sequential. The 37% unilateral is probably reaching steady state for their population. Now, one of the main concerns people have or had is bilateral endophthalmitis, bilateral simultaneous infection. In that 56,700, they didn't have a single case of endophthalmitis. This from a couple of years ago came from India, 42,000 phacos. How many endophthalmitis do you think they had? Answer, 1. This is using moxiflox, whereas we use cefuroxime. But the endophthalmitis rate around the world is falling massively. The second change we need to make is to get rid of that unnecessary, in my opinion, node of seeing a patient between optometry and theatre. So see and treat, or as we called it, O2O, optom to operation. This is not new. Alan Gaskell was doing this in Scotland in 2001. This is his same-day surgery percentage, 96, 3% deferred, and 1%. So he had a 99% conversion as long ago as that. Now, when you try and explain to people that you're quite happy to go straight from community to theatre, people will have these kinds of reasons. Not many people have a problem with the fact that something needs to change, but often people will say, I think you've not identified all the negative side effects, and I don't think you can overcome obstacles to implementation. Well, here's a fun way of looking at it. You can do this yourself if you go on .gov and go to the KSI stands for killed or seriously injured car driver casualties. It's a bit small to read, but on the bottom are the kind of 5-year age bands by driver, and you can see the U-shaped curve. The very young and the very elderly have the most car accidents. So the endophthalmitis rate is, bilateral endophthalmitis rate is approximately 1 in 28 million. So if you commute 10 miles each way to, well, even in fact, if you just commute 10 miles, 5 miles each way, and you're a 76-year-old patient with a husband or wife who's the same age, you are going to need a second journey for your second eye. You're actually 83 times more likely to be killed or seriously injured on that second journey than you are to get bilateral endophthalmitis. The question marks are because, well, you might not have an elderly husband driving you. You might come with a seriously safe coach driver who's aged 55, which is the best risk bracket to be in. So what happens if you've got a young driver? Well, you're still 21 times more likely to die in a coach accident than you are to get bilateral endophthalmitis. But of course, if you're commuting from Grampian to the Jubilee in Glasgow and you have to come twice, the figures become quite extraordinary. And Grampian is, in a sense, the only region perhaps eclipsed in complexity by NHS Highland, which covers the islands from the west. And a study was done by Andy Pyatt's group, looking at the number of road miles saved, the carbon savings, and we combined their data with the data from Tayside, and you can see there that the total carbon dioxide results are huge on the return car journeys. So although most people have shortish journeys, the NHS Highland journeys contribute massively. So we had a total of 1,400 plus patients from 1,400 patients from 267 surgeons in the whole of England and Wales and the Nod from 63 centres, whereas in Scotland, in NHS Highland and Tayside combined, we've got 3 or 4 surgeons doing about 1,200 bilateral cataracts per year. The second concern about doing bilaterals is, of course, refractive surprise. This is just a quick audit of our own data. This is Tayside data. The number with greater than 1 diopter out from delayed and immediate sequential are basically the same. And the randomized controlled trial published in the Lancet showed that there's no statistically significant difference in refractive surprise between delayed sequentials and the second eyes of immediate sequential. So really there is a firm evidence base for saying that is not a reason to delay second eye surgery. That study also found, unsurprisingly, that in the group that had immediate sequential, quite self-evidently, there was no troublesome period of anisometropia. So it's hardly worth doing the statistical test. And I saw a patient 6.5 days ago last Wednesday, and she showed me these photographs on her phone. This is 2 falls that she had when she was anisometropic between the first and the second eye. So it's not a trivial problem to have. If we drop out the weight between clinic with us and optometry in the community, the system that we use, which is a high fidelity digital referral system from the community that we've piloted in several shops, several premises in Dundee and Tayside, the average waiting time, Envoy is the name of the software, is 12 days. In Dundee, it was 24 weeks. And somewhere is nameless, but it was 560 days. So it's massively better. Again, you're not expected to read this, but we showed at the Royal College a couple of years ago the early results of this digital referral system. So we're able to take people direct from the community to theatre, and we currently list 90% at patient request directly to theatre, 90.1%. Time to listing is, apologies, it's yes, 13 days, and we list 55.6% as immediate sequential. The problem with getting to theatre, of course, is the red flags, and a lot of ophthalmologists will have some anxiety about the things that aren't spotted in advance, and probably uppermost in all of that is focus endothelial dystrophy, and it's very easy to tell tales in meetings of ones that you've spotted that others have missed. But in fact, we've not had any change in corneal decompensation rates. We use digital consent out in the community with a 4-minute, 30-second video to which the patient responds. with 4 questions. I've seen the video, yes. I understand the risks, yes. I have further questions, no. I'm happy to be directly listed, yes. That so-called golden path, yes, yes, no, yes, occurs in 90% of patients, and that's why we list 90% directly. Now, remember I said that you can't pay people in money or time. The only commodity you can pay people in is morale. And staff morale is, in a sense, the prerogative of hospital management. And it's a very, very difficult problem to keep, to be a custodian of morale. I think often hospital management assumes morale is like your bank balance in that it can go down at the month, but if we change a decision next month, it'll go back up again. But I think we all know that morale can be good for a decade and can be lost in a couple of weeks, not to be recovered for another whole 10 years. So Cataract 3.0, where will we go next? We are looking with a professor at post-op refraction, a PhD being done on that. Scotland needs by the year 2030 to get a cataract surgery rate up to about 10,000 per million. We've tried a no drop technique, presentation on that, won first prize at the SOC using a Kenalog steroid under the conjunctiva. We asked patients, which would you rather have, drops or an injection? And we did not use a euphemism. We just said that. You would assume that patients would find the word injection quite emotive and choose drops. We asked 80 patients, 79 opted for the injection. And what that tells you, I think, is that the idea that the patient has to have some agency in their own postoperative recovery probably stresses them more than the operation itself. If you take control, they find that basically okay to be passive in their own journey. What they don't like is having to take drops. But as you can see, Marge Simpson gets the last word, and we'll leave that to her.
Okay, here goes. Lately, what's keeping us together is my ability to overlook everything you do. And I overlook these things because...
Because?
Well, that's the thing. I just don't know how to finish that sentence anymore.
So the heading, of course, above Marge was, like Churchill's famous comment on democracy, the health service, the National Health Service, is the worst possible form of healthcare except for every other alternative. We're all very familiar with the frustrations inside working for the NHS. But if it collapses, it's hard to know what will replace it, isn't it? So we return, thank you very much to Jane for putting this back up, to the ISBCS. And 70% is probably the correct answer. We have just been working with the CFSD, putting out, hopefully in the next couple of months, the recommendations for indications and contraindications for ISBCS. And probably, like the Finnish, we are probably going to reckon that it's probably suitable for about 70%, 65, 70% of patients. In Tayside, we're getting closer and closer to that steady state, I think. And I'd be curious to know what other people are finding in their regions. But as I say, as far as we know, coding is difficult, but as far as we know, it's roughly 4% for the whole of Scotland. And John will be able to tell you what it is for England and Wales. Thanks very much. So I'll pass back to Helen for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That's absolutely fascinating and really helpful to understand what is going on, especially in NHS Tayside, and just all the information about what you're doing in high flow surgery and simultaneous same day. If you have any questions, I would recommend now putting those into the question box. Just feel free to put questions in there. Just to say, right, I'll just crack on then, John. We've got a question. When doing a referral, is it worthwhile mentioning if the patient is keen to go for sequential surgery? And kind of in brackets, that's for Glasgow. So what's the situation as a referring optom? How do we talk to patients about sequential surgery, and should we? And how do we know if it's being done in our area? Thanks.
There's a tension, isn't there, between two possibilities. One is that you can raise expectations that can't be met. and the other is that you could possibly drive from the community where the power lies. I would suggest drive a change, which is going to be the next soft revolution. In Tayside, where we offer that, I definitely want to hear, and if it says suitable or keen for immediate sequential, that unlocks that right from the word go. Teams that aren't keen to do it will pass them sideways to me because I'm quite happy to do it. So in a region where it's done, that's definitely the case. Andy Pyatt tells me that 20 ophthalmologists in Glasgow are now keen to start doing immediate sequential. The barrier to doing it is not necessarily the ophthalmologist. There are three stakeholders in a hospital: the managers, the nurses, and the ophthalmologists. And as I've spoken to all the regions in Scotland that I have spoken to, there are examples of every single one of those three constituencies being the rate limiting step. So it may be that the ophthalmologists are keen, but there is some anxiety amongst managers. And I'm not kidding. We have examples of people saying, well, you can't do it because we're nervous about it. I think what will happen is that when the CFSD document hits the kind of public domain and is out, I think there will be a tidal swell. So I think I would begin to put that the patient is keen for this and would be suitable for it. Some of the contraindications are the extremes of high hypermetropia because of the risk of that being associated with pachychoroid and cystoid macular edema. But high myopia, I mean, that for me is one of the indications precisely to do ISBCS, because if somebody's minus 7.5 and I make them close to metropia in the other eye and they have to wait for a long time, the waiting list in Tayside currently is 22 months. In Grampian, I believe it's 4 years. In Edinburgh, I don't know what it is. None of us are trying to be pejorative or cast stones or to compare regions. I think we're all sharing our pain as a nation who are trying to advocate for our patients. We're just aware that everywhere is broken. And I think this is the potential at scale to be one of the key ways of changing the future. Because if I do 1 day of 24 single eyes or 1 day of 30 bilateral, that's 15 patients, obviously, those are time equivalent. And as if you don't find the graph persuasive on first glance, get the editorial out and read the text that unpacks it. It's not my skill. The mathematical modeling was done by a genius in my department. But if you find it persuasive, then I think we need to try and tell secondary care that this is now a change that people are wanting and that there are regions providing it, and try and create a good momentum that way. Sorry, it's a long answer.
Well, thanks, John. And I think certainly I've heard recently sort of anecdotal reports where a patient has bilateral surgery and then tells friends, and the friends then go in to the optometrist and actually says, I want this. So I think it is certainly something that as community optometrists we need to be aware of and be at least able to discuss with the patient. So
yes. Yeah,
yeah.
I put SP positive, shorthand on a paper note. SP positive means social proof positive. And what's happening is that people are they're saying that their friend from church or the bowling club has had it bilaterally, why can't they? So I think you get a social echo happening quite quickly in a region, so that growth is logarithmic, not arithmetic. It goes up quite quickly once you start doing it.
Great. So just another question. If an optometrist thinks a Kenalog injection rather than post-op drop regimes would benefit a patient, should they annotate this on their referral to the hospital?
Now, this is I weep to answer this question. The answer is yes, obviously, and people do. So if you compare the price of Kenalog to a district nurse coming in a couple of times a day to administer Pred 40 for somebody who is still at home but has complex social needs, Kenalog is massively cheaper, and from the Kaiser Permanente study of 46,000 patients is actually better in reducing all the endpoints we want. The problem is that the manufacturer's taking Kenalog off the market. They're going to cease making it. It's off patent and not very lucrative for the company that makes it. So Kenalog is going to disappear. So I suspect there will be a period of some pain when we don't know what to do. There are other slow release steroid injections, depomedrone being one, and we might change to that. But I guess this takes you back to what Janet said. You are the patient's advocate. You know them better than we know them in secondary care. You have a longitudinal relationship with them. You know that their daughter lives in Plymouth and that she's come up just to attend the visit with you. You know all of that kind of stuff. And if they can't get the drops in and you say, look, some kind of long-term care, then I think, again, put that in the form. It's absolutely appropriate.
That's great. Thanks, John. So a question here, do you have any tips for making our cataract referrals better?
I think use Helen's aid memoir. My experience in Tayside is that the cataract referrals are really very, very good. What we piloted is a software system that is quicker than Sky Gateway. Those that have used it, there may be some on this call, prefer it because it's faster. It's high fidelity in the sense that it constrains you to explicitly state whether there's any other anterior segment pathology. No. Whereas I have to infer from a blank form, if it doesn't mention PXF or endothelial guttata, I have to assume that the argument from silence is that nothing mentioned means it's normal. But the high fidelity software means that I get a technical result from you guys. It's then linked by Kai to a questionnaire which goes to the patient, which incorporates CAT-PROM 5s. And I then know whether the patient wants the surgery. The two are linked by PDF, and I can list them directly on the basis of that. But the long and short of it is the quality of referrals, I think, is very good. And the 7 or 8 red flags, I think we can basically spot on the table and deal with at the time. If there's any that you think are worth mentioning, I'm delighted to hear them, obviously, and we try and factor those in. But things like whether a patient's pupil will dilate or not, I mean, I can decide on the day and deal with it on the day. It doesn't really matter. If they're male and over a certain age, they probably are on tamsulosin. So I just assume they are. So I'm fairly fatalistic about most of those things. But I think Helen's aid memoir is probably the way to do it.
Thanks, John. And it's also probably worth saying that we're currently doing a review of all the Sky Gateway referral templates. And I know John was involved. We've updated the cataract referral data set that will be for cataract referrals across all the boards, and they'll all be the same. So a lot of the things that John was mentioning will be standardized again. So hopefully, again, even if you don't necessarily put the data in, it will act as an aid memoir to remember to ask certain things or record it if it's important. So a question here about waiting times. Not sure if this is one where maybe Janet wants to come in, I'm not sure. As waiting times increase, is there any reliable source of waiting time data available to Optoms as we field a lot of the questions from those on waiting lists?
Janet, do you want to go first?
Oh gosh, this is a really difficult one because we don't have subspecialty data. So the boards do publish their waiting list for ophthalmology, but it's a general waiting list rather than a subspecialty waiting list. So I'm afraid it doesn't really help.
Right.
But John, you might have something in Tayside.
What I've taken to doing now is I dictate a letter to the Optom and GP when I list somebody. And I say in that, I've listed this lady for immediate sequential bilateral cataract surgery at the clinic this morning, full stop. Our waiting time for this is currently 22 months, full stop. So I put that in the letters, which means, I guess, that you can feel, because it is constantly changing. NHS Scotland, I think there's a website, it is woefully wrong. It is wrong by, it says sort of 3 months when in fact it's 2.5 years. So the figures I've thrown out, 22 months is correct for Tayside. In the middle of 2023, it was 9 months. It has gone up, not down. I don't know what's happened to Edinburgh because of the Jubilee, because of the pavilion. That's nobody's fault, but you can imagine. And I know that it was 4+ years in Grampian. Let me tell you a true story about last week. A patient on my list on the Wednesday before my Thursday list was discovered by my secretary to be deceased. So she went to the back of the waiting list yellow slips and pulled out the next one, deceased, the next one, deceased, 4 times. So this is a moral catastrophe that in a rich nation, people are dying on the waiting lists. The mean age at surgery in Scotland is 76 for cataract surgery. Mean life survival, life expectancy for men is 80. The exactly average patient male has 4 years left. If the waiting list is 4 eyes and that's first eye surgery only, not ISBCS, you don't have to be a genius to work out that is just a catastrophe, which is where we're all on this call for the same motive. We have to do something about it.
Yeah, thanks, John. Just a couple more questions. Just going back actually to the Canalog question again, is there any possibility of a generic alternative coming to Canalog if it is coming off the market? I think that's what the person means. Is there a generic alternative?
I mean, I'm going to express my ignorance, and John may know better than me, but I think Kenalog is kind of pretty generic already. It's triamcinolone. It's not a particularly expensive drug to produce or sell. They don't make much money on it. As I say, what you want is something that's relatively insoluble, so that the white crystals are visible under the in the lower fornix for up to 4, 5, 6, even 7 weeks, slowly dissolving, doing the magic. And depomedrone is a similar colloidal suspension. The thing about using Kenalog is that that's what the study was done on, and obviously they looked at the problem we're all nervous about, which is raised intraocular pressure and steroid responders. So they found those were not unacceptable, those spikes, if there were any, and that the CMO rate was lower than Pred-Forte. And the statistics on patient compliance on Pred-Forte or Maxidex, whatever your region uses, are unsurprisingly very, very bad. Patients just don't remember to take their drops, they're non-compliant. So the problem is there is an alternative, and I guess it needs somebody to do the study as to whether it has the same safety profile. Yeah, so sorry, it's a very approximate.
No, that's great. I think obviously you've been speaking, John, a lot about high flow surgery, and you're doing quite a lot more surgeries. You know, the comparative between high flow and perhaps normal, you're looking probably at like double the amount of surgeries in a session. But I guess perhaps a question maybe is are there any particular comorbidities though that might suddenly slow you down? Is that creating stress in the team, and how would you deal with that?
Okay, the answer to that, it's completely autobiographical, so I can't speak for anyone else. How we constructed it was we just take people as they come. There is no selection whatsoever. The only exception is that we don't tend to do posterior polar cataracts. My background is VR, so I'm actually personally happy to do posterior polar, but we don't list everyone else: kyphotic spine, can't lie flat, pseudoexfoliation, small pupils, tamsulosin. They just all go in together. Now, the 24 or 30 can be done in 7 out of the 8 hours, even allowing, well, we try to add training in, which brings us closer to the 8 hour. So when you have an all day theatre, if one patient slows you down, it's a bit like stretching a bigger elastic band. You've got more capacity in the day to make up time thereafter. And we work on the assumption that the mean time per case is 8 minutes, the median is 7, and the mode is 6. That's a little bit pessimistic. It's probably a bit quicker than that, surgical time. So, but that is allowing for the fact that we don't case select. I'm sure you're aware that the initial document on high volume used to be from the college, used to be called high volume, low complexity. And the college kind of changed that back to just high volume, full stop. Because it's disingenuous. It's not morally wrong. Why should a patient have to wait longer because they happen to have a complex eyeball? That's not their fault. They should still get care. So we're not seeing it being problematic. The most we've done in a day is 35. I think we could do 40 in an 8 hour session, but we have to slow it down for training. And I currently get the ST1s, and they do 4 in that day, and we finish on time. So. No, I don't think it's a problem, really. You're muted, Helen.
Apologies. We've got time for we've put about 3 more minutes or so we'll see if we can just get through these final ones. Just very quick, maybe. How long does Kenalog work for?
4 weeks.
Right, that's super. Somebody had a recent patient on, and I'm not going to pronounce this right, triamcinolone, apologies, which is a Kenalog 40 generic in NHS Highland. Will this still be available, or is that being discontinued as well? Have you any awareness of that, John?
I think that's being discontinued.
Okay.
Rosie from NHS Highland was the first to tell me that in fact there was a supply side problem, and it's not just, we had a period where we couldn't get them. It's not that, they just literally aren't going to bother making it. Sorry, I don't mean to be that rude. They're just not going to make it. So I think it's basically the same stuff, same problem.
Okay, that's great. And then just one more question, and actually a question for Janet. What role do you see, or do you foresee AI technology and robotic surgery will have in cataract assessment surgery in the future? Do you see a role for that, John?
Robotic surgery. The problem with cataract surgery, surgery is stochastic. That is to say, people are random. It's not like building a rocket. Building a rocket is complex. Taking out cataracts is complicated. Teaching primary school kids is complicated. So because people vary, my colleague and I, on a good day, can kind of do a cataract in sort of 4 minutes or less. It's hard to think a robot would do that better. I just don't think robotic surgery for prostate and so on is very, very avant-garde, but it's pretty slow. It's incredibly expensive, and in the end, nothing is probably as quick or as effective as somebody well trained who's happy to do it. So I don't think it'll have a role in that. What about assessment referral? I think you need human beings, because cataract does not equal lens opacity. You could have a robot to say this is 2 pluses of LOX score opalescence of the nucleus, but that's irrelevant if the patient's quite happy with that, or if they would have been desperately symptomatic at less than that. So I think we don't want to write ourselves out of the equation. I'm not a huge fan of AI.
No, and that just brings back to the fore, doesn't it? The importance of communication with a patient when you're referring, and having those conversations, which neatly takes me over to Janet for a question about the 2.9 supplementary. So there was a question early on, Janet. Can we or can you claim a 2.9 more than once per patient? So could you, for example, have a practice discussion with the patient and then do another follow-up telephone call with them?
Well, yes, theoretically you could. You'd have to document it really well, which of course you're all doing for every claim that you make, I'm sure. But so the intention really is not that you claim it twice. I suppose that the intention would be that you'd do your primary, or whether that might be a sup anyway, and then claim the other one when you would follow the patient up. But I can imagine there might be patients who are nervous about surgery and need to discuss it with their families, and might go away for a while and then come back. And of course, for those patients, as long as well documented, you can certainly claim another supplementary, of course. So yeah.
That's great, thank you. And then there was a comment about a standard referral form and criteria should be identical across all the health boards. There has been work, as I say. Yes, there has been work. We are going to have a standard referral form, so hopefully that'll be coming out by spring next year. So watch this space. Just before I introduce John Buchan, I would just say a huge thank you to John for that talk. It was fabulous. John did mention a video there that was done called A Nursing Success Story. It's absolutely brilliant. I would so recommend, if you want to watch high flow cataract surgery in action, it's fabulous. So if you just put it into YouTube, you'll find it. But absolutely would recommend that. And as John said, it's won awards, and when you watch it, you'll see why. Thank you again, John. And so it's an absolute pleasure to now introduce Dr. John Buchan. So John is also a very highly experienced consultant ophthalmic surgeon who is currently working in Leeds Teaching Hospital. John is also the clinical lead of the National Ophthalmology Database Cataract Audit, of which he'll be sharing some of the detail of that this evening, as well as being an associate professor in the International Centre for Eye Health in London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So a huge thanks to John Buchan for coming along and speaking with us as well tonight. And I will let you take over, John. John, you're just on mute.
Thank you. It would have been a long 45 minutes if I had stuck on that. So yeah, thank you. It's quite a talk to follow, but I think there's going to be a lot of not commonality material, but in the direction. And I think there's a quantity issue, and there's also the quality to consider. So I think these two talks will sit very well with each other. I think I can use I've got control of the screen. Excellent. Yeah, so I work 1 day a week for the Royal College of Ophthalmologists for this project called the National Ophthalmology Database, and we receive some funding. It's unrestricted from Alcon, Bausch and Lomb, but I've no other competing interests to declare. So this, what is the NOD? I'm going to call it the NOD from now on. It's the National Ophthalmology Database Cataract Audit, which is run under the auspices of the Royal College. And it started, this paper is from 2009, and they called it the Cataract National Dataset. However, it only included data from 12 NHS trusts, all of which were using Medisoft. I think there might have been 1 Scottish trust and 7 English trusts at that point. Well, they're not trusts, hospitals, basically, that were using the thing. And the data, this 55,000 operations, they called it the national data set, and they set up this national ophthalmology database, which wasn't at all national, just 12 hospitals out of over 100. But it was a sort of statement of intent, because it has become increasingly national since then, such that in the last NHS audit year 2023 to 24, we had 200 centres, including Northern Ireland, Wales. We don't have any centres in Scotland, but in conversation with Scottish Government, we are expecting a centrally funded participation. So this, we would hope, with the rollout of electronic medical record, if that's seen nationally, then we expect data. And so I'm very hopeful that within the next few years, this will be something which is live and in your area and informing care for your patients. But as you can see here, in the last audit year, we got over 500,000 cataract operations data submitted to us, which in England represents over 80% of all the cataract operations done by the NHS last year. So we really are, on the curve of adoption. They've gone from those innovators right through now, and it's only the laggards who are not participating. And so I'm sending them emails pointing out that they're laggards, and see how far that gets me. So what I'm going to talk to you in the next 40 minutes is about why would you want a national cataract audit? So if it didn't exist, would you create it? What can you do with it? And looking at quality assurance and quality improvement and the difference between those two things. And I'm hopeful that for yourselves as optometrists, there'll be some useful information in there as well, not just about, about your part in that process, but also about the informed consent, because increasingly, if we see that model that John Ellis was proposing, that it's within the community setting that patients they have those extended conversations, and in effect the consent process, signing the bit of paper, isn't the consent. The consent is the conversation that the patient then the conversation and the thought process that the patient goes through before they arrive at surgery, and that very much we hope would happen in the primary care setting, not when you're just about to go in for your operation. So quality assurance, then, if you're manufacturing something, you want to root out the bad thing. So what's quality? So this is me. Here's a question for you. So in my head, and I've said this out loud in management meetings, I said that I want to provide cataract surgery in my hospital that's good enough for me to have when I'm old. So that's something I'll say to the management when I'm trying to get them to do something to make things better. But is that really true? Because I'm pretty fussy, and particularly if it comes down to eye surgery, I think I'll be very fussy. So does it all have to be good enough for me? And you can substitute yourself in there. Does everyone's operation have to be good enough for you as an eye care professional? Well, you could say, well, maybe if not for me, what about for, at least for my mother? Here's my mother. This is my actual mother. So if my mother comes to have her cataracts done, who lives in Glasgow, so she might come to see one of yourselves. And do I think everyone's operation should be good enough for her, or at least should everyone's operation be good enough for my mother-in-law? Well, that's not my real mother-in-law. Here comes my real mother-in-law. So if you think about quality, you have to ask, well, how good is good enough? So we're going to have a Slido there, and just be interested in people's. Do we think we should be providing cataract surgery that's good enough for eye care professionals or their mothers or their mother-in-laws? Which way would you go with that? Right, so just over half of you are having the same aspirational statement that I would make. I think everyone's eye surgery should be good enough for eye care professionals. Anyway, we could revisit that poll in a wee bit after I want to unpack some aspects of quality for you then. So which IOL, intraocular lens? So I'm appreciative that not everyone on this call is an optometrist. I believe there's some dispensing opticians, and there might even be some practice managers or other staff members, team members. So please forgive me if I'm patronizing anyone, but I'm just going to explain that when we do a cataract operation, we take out the natural lens you were born with and put in an intraocular lens, which is like a contact lens rolled up. And the power of that lens we can choose from our cupboard full of lenses, and it's based on basically two main measurements: the axial length, how long the eyeball is, and then how much refractive power the cornea has. So once we've removed the lens, the cornea is the only refractive thing there. And so in this instance, the axial length is 22.85 millimeters. And there's two K readings because you have to take the steepest axis and the least steep axis. So in this example, I've made the math easy for myself by putting it at 90 and 180. And we've got a delta K, that's the difference between the steepest axis and the least steep axis, is minus 1.25 diopters. So that's the biometry that we do on all patients. That's how we calculate our lenses. Now, as a mark of quality, there's lots of different lenses. And again, John Ellis mentioned there's premium lenses. How premium are the premium lenses? I don't know. And I would also want a monofocal lens. I think I'd be very happy with any of the lenses on this board. But if we choose a monofocal lens, so I'm just going to pick one of them, and some may well be better quality than others. Certainly some of them have more complication rates associated with the lenses. And it's notable that the cheaper lenses have higher complication rates. We've published that from our NOD study. I'll come to that later. But the question, there's another Slido coming up here. So if you, as you're the optometrist, someone said, right, you're getting your cataract done, which lens would you like put in the eye there? So I hope you can see if you put a 21.5 diopter lens in, you'll end up with minus 0.03, so pretty much emmetropic. But if you'd rather be a bit myopic, you could put a 23 diopter. So I'm about to put up a Slido with all those numbers on, 23 down to 20. And you can choose which lens you like. So if you make your choice first, and then I'll flip onto the Slido, and you can make a choice. If you want to, I've also done none of the above. You want 250 and read unaided, and don't care about wearing distance glasses, then you can put none of the above. So if everyone's chosen their lenses, if you could enter which number you fancied. Okay, interesting. So 22.5 and 23 are top choices. 21.5, a little bit there. So 21.5, 22.5, 23 are the options that people are going for. And we've now got 120 votes. So I'm just going to flip back to that slide so we can see, okay, the results there. So 22.5 is the most popular, followed by 23. So when a 22.5 would give us a minus 0.71 spherical equivalent, and 23 minus 1, 21.5, aiming for emmetropia. There was 17% wanting emmetropia. That's very interesting. No one went for 22. Okay, so to unpack that decision-making process there, I'm going to add some nuance to that. So can or does the surgeon operate on axis? So if you look at this picture of an operation going on here below, the surgeon's sitting at, say, 12 o'clock at 90 degrees, and they've made their incision at about 110 degrees, I would suggest, or 100, between 100 and 110. So if you stick your keratome in, and it's about 2.5 millimeters, so you've made a hole in the eye of 2.5 millimeters width, you're going to reduce the amount of astigmatism by about 1/4 of a diopter. Give or take, it depends on where you are around the eye, how close you are to the optical axis. But if your surgeon can be bothered putting their knife in at 90 degrees where the steepest axis is, they'll reduce your amount of astigmatism by 1/4 of a diopter. If, however, the surgeon prefers to sit slightly to the side, like they like to sit on the temporal aspect, then they would sort of routinely, to be comfortable for the surgeon, they'd make a hole at 180 degrees, around the corner there, and that would increase your astigmatism by a quarter of a diopter, and that would then put you up. So best case scenario here is that the surgeon can be bothered, that they put their incision in at 90 degrees, and that will reduce the postoperative astigmatism that you get. And so you might end up with emmetropic with a -1, which would give you a spherical equivalent of -0.5, and that would fit in with quite a lot of people's choice. A lot of people were choosing a -0.71 outcome there. So going back to that set of options and lenses, you see, we don't ask the patients what lens they want. The surgeon just decides based on whatever the surgeon thinks, and the surgeon sits where the surgeon wants to sit, and does or doesn't operate on axis to reduce things. So there's a quality issue there, and that some surgeons will spend more time thinking and discussing with the patients what they want, what they like to do, unaided. Some surgeons, and quite a lot of surgeons, will just stick in whatever lens is closest to emmetropia, which sounds like a reasonable option, and that was what I was told to do as a trainee in the 90s. Was, you go for the lens near 0 because we want distance vision, and then they can wear glasses. But I suggest a bit more thinking is worthwhile there. So I want to ask you again, given that, maybe if you just to rethink that, which lens would you choose based on, if we assume the surgeon's going to be able to reduce your astigmatism, if those were your 3 refractive outcomes, which of those would you prefer? So the 17% of people who chose a 21.5 aiming for emmetropia, the question is, would you still want that 21.5? Yes, it gets you, the spherical equivalent is as close to emmetropia as you can get for the 21.5, or would you prefer? Anyway, we're going to go to the poll and see which one of those you like. Okay, so it's actually not actually changed that much. There's still quite a lot of people who are wanting to aim for an emmetropic outcome as a spherical equivalent. So I'm going to just further unpack this issue of quality by saying that what the surgeon aims for and what the surgeon gets are not the same thing. So this is some real world data. This is a refractive outcome audit I did for a hospital, not in the UK actually, but I just included it to make the point that actually in this hospital, what the surgeon aimed for, as in if you got what you aimed for, you'd be 0 in this graph. So it's what you actually get is a normal distribution around the central point at what you aim for. But actually in this hospital, they were systematically getting a more myopic outcome than they were expecting. Now, in the calculations you make for the lens, if you're systematically making everyone myopic, it's easy to add in a fudge factor and just give everyone a slightly weaker lens than you were planning, and you can shift that graph easily to the left or the right with your fudge factor, called the A constant, that we include in our calculation. So moving that graph left or right is easy, but the point is that even if you have a normal distribution centered around whatever refractive outcome you might choose, so you might decide to aim for -0.5 routinely, but you still have half of the patients to the right and half to the left. So it means that if you choose a lens aiming for emmetropia exactly 0, about half the time you're going to end up hypermetropic, which is no use to anyone, and the other half you end up myopic. So in a way, you're not choosing a lens you're not choosing the exact outcome, you're choosing where you want your normal distribution to be centered. So quality, I would suggest to you that quality means that we're going to be trying for our patients to get them the sort of refractive outcome that we ourselves might find most useful. So that would involve trying to get rid of outliers. For the UK, we have benchmarks. We suggest that 55% of patients need to be within half a diopter of what we aimed for. But that means that half the patients pretty much are more than half a diopter away from our aim. And in fact, we only have, our benchmark is about 85% is I think the stated benchmark nationally for 85% within 1 diopter, which means that 15% of patients are going to be more than a diopter away from what you aimed for. So you have to decide whether you're happy with that. And some centres will be running a tighter, with better biometry, better outcomes, fewer outliers than others. And that might not be immediately obvious to you, but that's another aspect of quality. So I throw that in at the start to throw some doubt into your mind, really, because what I'm going to try and do now is is to sell you the idea that we need national audit, that if we don't have it, we are the poorer for it, and we underserve our patients if we don't have big data to get big patient benefit. Because there's lots of different aspects of quality that are slightly invisible to you as a referrer, to the patients, and to us in the future as beneficiaries. When we're lying on that table, we might be lying there thinking, if you can remember back to this talk, you can think, what is this surgeon putting their hole on my steepest axis? What lens have they chosen for me? What's my outcome going to be? That sort of thing. So with our national audit, because we have big data last year, we can answer so many questions. And again, for those who haven't, if you've been in practice a lot of years and you haven't seen cataract surgeries, or if maybe for dispensing up some optician colleagues. So cataract then is the clouding of the lens, but the lens is of course held within a naturally occurring collagen bag within the eye, this called the capsule. And one of the main things we try and avoid when doing cataract surgery is busting the capsule. So we deliberately tear a hole in the front of the capsule, and then we scoosh some water around the back of the lens to free it up. And then as we break the lens out, we try and remove the little bits of the lens without making a hole in the capsule, and certainly without dropping any of the bits of lens into the back of the eye and sending it to a vitreoretinal surgeon. We put our cap in our hand and go and ask them if they can please help us out because we've dropped something. So that's posterior capsule rupture, and that's our primary outcome. So for us as a national audit, we are interested in things like refractive outcomes, although we don't report on that routinely at the moment. But one of the main things we're looking at is complication rates. Because when I come to have my cataract surgery, although I might care a little bit about where the keratome is being stuck, where my steep axis is, I'm much more worried about whether someone's going to make a hole in the capsule at the back of my lens during the operation, or that they're going to tug my zonules off and that the vitreous is going to come forward, which will be a huge loss. So why is PCR? So I'm going to call that PCR, posterior capsule rupture, but I'll refer to it as PCR from now on. So if that complication occurs, it gives you a 20-fold risk of retinal detachment in the year following surgery, 17 times the risk of severe bleeding during the surgery that can, in the worst cases, blind the eye. And in my operative career, I've had several eyes, I think 3 or 4, blinded due to severe bleeding during a different technique rather than phaco, but still, this is from UK data. This is our NOD data. So it gives you a 16-fold chance of losing 0.6 logmar. So if you don't speak logmar, that's about 4 lines on the Snellen chart. 7 times the risk of endophthalmitis, although the risk is very low. So although 7 times risk is a lot, it's a 7 times a small number. Or a 6 times risk of losing 0.3 logmar from pre to post-operatively. So instead, you went in for cataract surgery, and instead of your vision getting better, your vision gets worse. Because of this posterior capsule rupture, and it increases your risks of that. So how often does that happen? Well, this is a scatter plot. It happens different amounts for different people. Every little purple dot on this graph is a surgeon, and on the x-axis, you've got the number of operations they've done in a 12-month period, and on the y-axis, you've got the PCR percentage. That's what percentage of patients. So you can see the sort of most unfortunate surgeons you could suggest, or anyway, the surgeons with the worst results are doing 6 or 7% of their patients have had posterior capsule rupture, but they're quite low volume surgeons. So it might only be that they did 50 cases and they had 4 complications, and that would give you 8%, which would be the sort of worst person on this graph. But on the right-hand side of the graph, and this is one of the reasons why we'd be highly supportive of the high volume services, because the more you do on your operating list, the more you do in a year. And you can clearly see that the surgeons on the right-hand side of that graph, none of them have above 0.5%. I think above 3,000 operations, certainly there's no one with more than 0.5% posterior capsule rupture rate. So these are very high volume and safe surgeons on the right hand side, whereas on the left hand side, if you get someone who's only doing 100 cataracts a year, you could easily be putting yourself in the hands of someone who has got a 4 or 5% PC rupture rate. And 4 or 5% is quite a lot. So if we turn that into actual human beings, well, I'll do that in a second, but if I was one of the surgeons on the left-hand side and I had a 4 or 5% PC rupture rate, I might say to you, yes, but I do all the more difficult cases. I get the patients with the Parkinson's disease or the coughing from the chronic obstructive airways disease, that sort of thing. So I could complain about my patients, or I could complain about their eyeballs and say they've all got pseudoexfoliation, diabetes, and it's not my fault. So with the NOD data, from an analysis of nearly 1 million eyes, 960,000 eyes, we looked at what factors predict for complication rates, PCR specifically. So we could create this risk model. So before you have your surgery, we can then tell you what your risk is of having a PC rupture. And if we can do that for you as an individual, we can do it for all the individuals, and we can look at which hospitals are seeing patients that are more complicated, which surgeons are doing operations that are more difficult. So if you look at the case complexity index here on this chart, this is a list of different hospitals in England and Wales, and some of them are, if you look at the two lowest numbers on the list under case complexity are 1.1 for Benenden Health. Now I'll tell you that's an entirely private healthcare institution. They only do private practice cataracts to my knowledge, and therefore, all those eyes are pretty simple, basically, because normally the people going for private practice are going at an early stage in the disease process, and their eyes are relatively straightforward. CHECK is another one at the bottom there, 1.08, very low complexity score, and that's another private organisation that actually does NHS cataracts. But if you're into a traditional NHS provider, so halfway down Bradford Royal Infirmary, I used to work there, that's a 1.96. So you can see that the complication rate is expected to be almost double in the patients at Bradford than it is in one of the private setups. And so that's why if you hear about cherry picking in the English system, you can cherry pick because we know who's likely to cause us trouble, and we can avoid those patients by sending them to the local NHS trust rather than the private centre. So well, how useful is that then for me as a surgeon? So I work in Leeds teaching hospitals. This is a graph not of surgeons, but of hospitals. So I can see that our complication rate in Leeds teaching hospitals from all the operations we do, and we've got nearly 18,000 on this because I expanded the data set to about 4 years. So we've done 18,000 operations, and we were running a 1.4% PC rupture rate. So I could look at that and feel a bit disappointed that Leeds say, we're not doing so well. But that's not adjusted for case complexity. Once you apply our case complexity on the next graph, you can see that we drop right down to actually less than 1% of what would be the expected rate. So because we're taking on more complicated cases, I can't tell you who the other blue dots are, but I can tell you that Leeds, then we actually appear slightly better than average, that actually we are protecting our patients from complications as well as we might. Not as well as some, but better than others. So that's why the risk adjustment's really useful, because it takes away any special pleading or excuses about why complication rates might be high. So I wanted to put it to you in another Slido poll. If you say you work in an optometry practice that's halfway between two hospitals, so some of your patients go one way, some go another, do you think you would notice if one of your hospitals had double the rate of complications of the other hospital? So if you think back to that graph, you'd only need a hospital at 0.5 and a hospital at 1. People talk, patients talk, nurses talk, doctors talk. So there's conversations, but sometimes the things that make us think that the quality is high might be the car parking or how comfortable the seats were, not the actual statistics. So if you don't have a national audit, you don't have visibility, and more importantly, the hospitals themselves don't have visibility on the actual rates of complication that they are experiencing. So in my own theatre, I don't know what the other consultants are doing. I don't get to see what their complication rates are. But with national audit, I do get to see where we are as a hospital, and I get to know where I am relative to everyone else. So it's like a mirror. Every year, one of those charts is produced, and we as a hospital look at ourselves in that mirror and say, how are we doing? Particularly because we're a training institution, are we protecting our patients from the learning curve, the inevitable learning curve that is there with now that's great. So about half and half. So half of you think you probably would notice, and half probably think you might not. When we go into other aspects of quality where I think we can, and we might even revisit that conversation. So there's quality assurance then, how bad is too bad? And then there's quality improvement. How can we make ourselves better? So if we go back to these, every blue dot is a surgeon, and I'm the yellow star because I can only see who I am. I can't see who everyone else is. But what I can say is that this is a 1 year of data, 2018 to 2019. And so I could say, well, I had a bad year and had a few complications, but you can't, I've stretched it now to 6 years. You can't really say I had a bad 6 years. I don't think that's a reasonable thing to assert. So if you look at some of these red triangles over here, these are people who are above 3 standard deviations above the mean. So there's a surgeon there who did 1,000 cataracts in 6 years, so they're doing plenty, but they had an over 5% PC rupture rate. That means 1 in 20 of their patients had a posterior capsule rupture with all those risks that I told you about. So, and if we put that into human faces, actual people, that's instead of over 1,000 operations, you're talking about 50 patients who had complications of their surgery. And if those 1,000 patients had been in the hands of the average surgeon with around 1%, that would have been 40 patients who didn't get that complication, 40 patients who didn't need to suffer the additional stress of going back for further surgery in many cases and dealing with the complications associated with PCR. So if you don't have national audit, that red triangle does not find out who they are. They don't know that they're an outlier particularly. They may be aware that they're having some complications and the nurses might talk, but actually it's not visible to them or to their clinical lead in the hospital. And whereas with national audit, everybody gets to see where they stand relative to everyone else. And so those patients can then be protected. Conversations can be had with surgeons like that and say, maybe it's either time to retrain or consider not doing cataract surgery, because there's plenty of work to do. There's absolutely no shortage and there's no need for everyone to do cataract surgery if that's the sort of complication rate you're running. So for me, I would like, when it comes to my turn to have cataract surgery, I would like it to be in a hospital where surgeons know what their complication rate is and they know where they stand relative to everyone else. So for me, national audit is something I would look for in a hospital that I was going to have my operation in. So at least I know that people are aware of their situations. So it's not just PC rupture we look at. We also look at vision loss. So we look at what could the patient see before and what could they see afterwards. And anyone who loses more than 2 lines of Snellen, so 0.3 logmar or more. So if you came in seeing 618 and you went out 636, then you're a vision loss case. And there's various reasons for that. Sometimes it's linked to posterior segment problems. Sometimes the cornea decompensates. Some of those things may be correctable in the very long term, but not always. And so it's just the raw measurements, how many people lost to, and it's about half a percent now. And so again, I can see where I am and everyone else can see where they are. And hospitals also can see where they stand on that. So ISBCS, as John's talked you through, I'm not going to mention that then, just to say we can track that. And again, in England and Wales, it's very low uptake, despite the fact that we have a nice south of the border, which is a bit like SCAN, I think it is, you have, who do the referral guidelines. And anyway, they recommend it for the majority of patients. It would come to over 70% if we went with their guidance, but not that uptake's not being seen as yet. But we're tracking that, and it means that we can also track the complications of it when it becomes more popular, as we hope it will. The other thing we can do with national audit, which is hard to do without, it's not impossible, but it's hard, is to actually look at social deprivation and social determinants of healthcare access. So we know from our data in the NOD that from the least affluent, from the poorest 10% of the patients on the NOD, that 10% of them have a logmar better than 0.3. So that's 612, better than 612. So basically 10% of the poorest decile patients are coming before they're anywhere near the driving standard, compared to in the richest decile, it's nearly heading for 20% of patients are coming at 6.9 basically. So certainly you can see from that figure that the richer people are wanting their cataract surgery done sooner because they can't see the golf ball or whatever. It may be because they drive cars more often than those in the poorest 10%. There may be other factors. But I'm not so interested in who's coming at 6.9. I'm much more interested in who has waited till they're 660 or worse. So that's 1 logmar. So if you look here, and if you're in the least affluent decile, a quarter of patients are at 660 or worse when they come for their cataract surgery, compared to in the richest decile, it's 13.4%. So heading for half of that, so that's 1 in 7, 1 in 8 patients in the richest 10% are at 660 or worse. Now, I can't say for sure that that's because the system is inequitable, because people in the poorest decile also have more age-related macular degeneration, they have more diabetes. So there are other reasons why there might be more people with 660. It doesn't necessarily mean, but I can track that with national audit, which I can't do without. In Scotland, in fact, myself and Graham Kirkwood and Alison Pollock from Newcastle University, we did a project looking at Scottish waiting times to see whether the difference between the richest and the poorest patients in terms of the waiting times was growing. Now, we don't have any post-pandemic data, so you may say this is not super relevant, but certainly from 2010 to 2019, although the waiting times may have grown, they weren't growing inequitably. So in fact, the difference between the rich and the poor in terms of waiting times didn't change at all, with the austerity measures that came in through that decade. So that's really positive in terms of the way that Scottish healthcare has been delivered, and yourselves as optometrists, who's coming to you and who is being referred. Now in England, there's the sight test fee, so we can't be quite so confident that rich and poor are accessing. So we're grateful for national audit to be able to monitor that. So you could say, right, that's very nice, you've made some nice graphs and it's helpful for the surgeons, I'm sure, but does it actually help patients? Does the fact that I as a surgeon, or me as Leeds Hospitals, that we can look at ourselves in the mirror, I see that I'm not very good, but what can I do about it? Some surgeons are just slightly more skillful than other surgeons, probably, and some hospitals better organized than others. So does actually doing the audit improve anything for anyone? Does it actually do what it says it does, which is do quality improvement? Well, so every circle on this graph is a hospital, and the y-axis here is the ratio of adjusted PCR rates before and after joining the National Ophthalmology Database. So if a hospital, so there's a hospital near me, Huddersfield, they're not on the nod for whatever reason, and so in conversation with them, but they've got an electronic medical record, Medisoft, that they've had for a decade. So if they join the nod, I can then look at their PC rupture rates for the last decade, and then I can follow their PC rupture rates for the next decade, and I can create a ratio. What was your PC rupture rate before you joined and after you joined? And so anyone below the line, which I've colored blue, means that the ratio is below 1. So if you were sitting on the line, then it means that you had exactly the same PC rupture rate after as you did beforehand. But you can see there's very few hospitals where the PC rupture rate got worse after joining the nod in the 2 or 3 years after joining compared to the 2 or 3 years before. Most hospitals, if we have data before and after joining, then the rate drops after they join, because from that point it's sort of like the Hawthorne effect. You know that Big Brother's watching you a little bit. I mean, some people argue that people may be fudging their results and hiding their complications, but I would suggest that's difficult in a modern eye department with an electronic medical record, because there's boxes to tick, and it's not impossible, but if you start hiding results, you might get struck off. So this is the overall trend. So if you look at the bottom line here, the other two lines I've shown you before, that's the number of hospitals joined. We're up to 200 hospitals now participating. The number of cataracts done at over 500,000, but the PC rupture rates dropped from 1.9 in 2010, which, you know, back in 2010, I was an eye surgeon back then. We thought we were doing pretty well, and we had a 2% complication rate. We used to tell patients that, and but now we're well under 1%, and that's really gratifying that has come down. Now, there's not been that much change in technology in the last 13 years. The phaco machines are probably slightly better. Certainly there's some aspects of this thing, but it's the same people doing the same thing. There's just various things that we think have improved it. And I would like to argue that one of those things has been the fact that people have this national audit, and that therefore they're able to see their complication rates and really think about how to reduce those. So other things that you can't really look at rare events unless you have big data. So suprachoroidal hemorrhage that I mentioned to you before, about where the eye bleeds horribly internally during the operation. So it's because you've dropped the intraocular pressure to 0. So the pressure differential between inside the blood vessel and outside the blood vessel is bigger, because you've no longer got 20 millimeters of mercury of aqueous pressure and vitreous pressure holding the blood inside the vessel. So sometimes the blood vessels burst. So you can't really evaluate that yourself because it happens 1 in every 3,500. But with a national database, you can look at that, and we're able to do research to identify which patients are most at risk of this, and then advertise that to surgeons so they're now aware of very rare events. And so you can see that this is the risk factors that we produce. If you're over the age of 90, you're running a 7 times risk of that. If your intraocular pressure was high before the operation, then you're dropping the pressure more when you open the eyeball, and that gives you a 4 times risk factor. So it's not the detail of that, it's just the fact that there's no way on earth you can do that sort of research or find that sort of thing out unless you have big data on a national level. The same with endophthalmitis. Our rates are not quite as impressive as the Indians or those from the Americans. So on our data, we're looking at about, just to flick through that, 1 in 5,000 was our rate. But again, it's very hard for a hospital. Even a busy hospital might only do 3,000 or 4,000 cataract operations a year, and therefore it's hard for you to know whether your rate is high. But on a national level, we can track that, and we could look for outliers and risk factors, and we can show that, if, as you see here on this graph here, what's a risk factor for infection? Having a PC rupture. The main thing we don't want when we have a cataract is to have PC rupture. So I'm going to dance on from that. So local anaesthetic. There's 2 last things I want to bring to you that may matter. Is about local anaesthetic. So again, we did a large analysis of this, looking at who's doing what. Now, this is the percentages of eyes done with topical anaesthesia alone. So that's just eye drops in order to have your surgery. So no numbing injection. So you can see the bottom 2 bars between 2010 and 2019, the proportion of patients having just eye drops as their anaesthetic went from just over 40% to just over 60%. But it does mean that there is still, and this is still the case, there's still a good chunk, more than a third of patients are having a needle stuck around their eye to have as an anaesthetic. So we look at which hospitals do that. So every bar on this graph is a hospital. So on the far left, there's hospitals that are only doing topical. Basically every single patient, almost without exception, is getting just eye drops for their cataract surgery. And on the far right, in the pale blue and the purple, those are patients who are getting either a subtenon's injection or a sharp needle for their anaesthetic. So that level of clinical, there's no rationale, really. There's no clinical reason why some hospitals should choose to put needles in. And when we looked at the complication rates from the needles, the sharp needles, everyone, you can imagine what the complication rates of those are, but even the blunt needles, there are complication rates associated with that. So I would be a strong advocate of people moving over. And if these 10 hospitals on the left can all do all their cataract surgery just with eye drops, I don't see any reason why the 10 hospitals on the right need to be putting a needle around the back of everyone's eyes. Now, I'm not strongly opposed to needles at all, except that it takes slightly longer, and it has a carbon cost to it. So in Leeds, we've done a carbon footprinting exercise on local anaesthetic, and it's small. It's 50 odd grams of that you're saving, but there's a waste issue. There's the carbon dioxide equivalents, and if the people on the right hand side of this graph stopped doing needles and started doing injections, it would in fact save a bit of carbon each time. But because we're doing in the UK 750,000 cataracts, 750,000 times a very small number is quite a big number, and so there are savings, financial and ecological, by changing practice. So again, it's having a national ophthalmology database allows us to go to the people on the right hand side of this graph and say, listen guys, we realized that in the 1990s everyone was doing an injection for everyone, but lots of people have migrated. Maybe it's time that you do too. So I just want to put this question to you then, and this is, I'm going to finish on this thought, is what do you want when you're seeing a patient, or as I as a surgeon am seeing a patient, do you think that the immediate needs of the patient in front of me are very important, or are they really paramount? So you could imagine yourself, say you've been diagnosed with cancer, you go and see the doctor, and the doctor's thinking, okay, what treatment shall I give this person? And they might think, well, this drug costs £100,000. But our budget's really quite stretched for this year. So do you want the doctor to be thinking about the whole picture, Or do you really want just the doctor to be thinking, what's right for this, what does this patient need? So that's the sort of tension here. What would you want? Do we think that the immediate needs of the patient are very important, or are they paramount? Okay, that's settling down, 110 votes. So yeah, so over a third of people feel that it's, the immediate needs of the patient in front of you are paramount. And that's really what I want my doctor to be thinking. Like, I want my clinician to think, actually, all they care about is what's right for me, because I'm their patient and that's their duty of care to me. However, the healthcare budget is pretty fixed. The resources of planet Earth are pretty fixed. And every £1,000 you spend on one thing is £1,000 you don't have to spend on other things. And if you think of the core NHS activity provides about one QALY for every £10,000, that's one quality adjusted life year. So it makes one person live 1 year longer at full quality of life. And certainly I would buy a year for £10,000. I'd start saving up now if I could buy years of full quality life at that price. So it's just to think about that money we spend on one thing is money we don't have to spend on another. So for me, some surgeons take the attitude that they want to spend more money on certain things. They might be markers of quality, but if that steals from someone else, even albeit a faceless someone else, and that's one thing that Kenalog argument is. So we published a paper from Leeds showing that you could save a lot of money by putting in Kenalog injections because you don't spend money on district nurse budget. Yeah, so that's our paper on carbon footprinting and local anaesthesia, and yeah, so it's a sort of dilemma for all of us. Is what do we want our clinicians to be thinking about, and what do you want other people's clinicians to be thinking about? Because really, those two answers have to be the same, don't they? I mean, what I want my clinician to be thinking about is me, but actually, I recognise that we are all pulling from the same pot, and we all need to take a sort of collective and collaborative approach, which is difficult to achieve. And John Ellis's talk earlier, I think, went into that really nicely. So I bring that up as a finishing thought, because there are cheaper lenses that give you more posterior capsular pacification. And I'm not going to go through that now, but just to say that these are the distributions of different lenses going into eyes in our databases. There's and we know from analysis that some of those lenses run double the posterior capsular pacification rate than others at 5 years. And these are huge numbers. So we've got tens of thousands of people in this analysis. And if you look at the two most popular lines are the purple line and the turquoise line. So if I point at 5 years, if you put in a hydrophilic lens, you're getting more than 50% of your patients have had a YAG laser or PCO by 5 years later, whereas it's only 25% if you put in a hydrophobic lens, which is, they're slightly more expensive, but they halves the PCO rate. And the bruising we saw on that lady with anisometropia, you could equally apply that to someone with undiagnosed PCO who's waiting for their YAG laser. And money spent on, so what I'm suggesting with this is that hospitals trying to save money by putting in cheap lenses with high PCO rates are actually doing everyone a disservice and wasting money for everyone else. So I hope these slides will be made available to you, but these are the sort of statistics that one could quote to a patient if they were asking, if you wanted statistics to put in your information leaflets about the sort of risks of cataract surgery. And all of that's come from a national ophthalmology database. And it's allowed us to make this journey from quality improvements to quality assurance, from quality assurance, how bad is too bad, to quality improvement and trying to make things better. And we hope to expand that. So that's all I really wanted to say. And it just brings us back to that question about who we want our surgery to be good enough for. And bearing in mind that tension around what we want things to do, I aspire to provide everyone with an operation that I would be happy to have. But at population level, I'm happy, and some surgeons may say they don't feel comfortable sitting on axis. They all want to sit at the top all the time and put their incision at the same axis at 120 degrees every time. And I'll say, well, fine, if that's all you can manage, then that's what you need to do. I wouldn't be happy with that for myself, possibly not for my mum. But I think at population level, we can accept that good enough is good enough, but probably a 4-year waiting time is not good enough after a lifetime of tax paying, and people deserve better. So thank you very much. That's the end of the talk. So we can stand those slides down there. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, John. If you've got a question now's your time to put it into the Q&A. We've got a good few minutes now to go through questions, John. So, and the first thing, John did mention there that about the slides being available. We have recorded the session tonight and they will be made available, because certainly in terms of the information there about really very much evidence-based in terms of the risks that we can be talking to patients about, or in that kind of that 2.9 supplementary, that pre-referral chat is really helpful to be able to give that personalised information to patients. So thank you so much for providing that. And the NOD report is also available on the internet, so you can just go to the NOD website and there is a yearly report published. And as John mentioned, sorry, go on, John.
It hasn't. We haven't put it out yet from last year because we've got so much data to process. 550,000 operations has taken. It's getting increasingly difficult for our statisticians. We work through that, and so we're about. It's taking us almost 10 months from getting the data to publishing the full analysis of it.
Yeah, well. The great news is that, as John also mentioned, it is the intention that Scotland will be joining the NOD. So in due course, we hope that across Scotland we'll also be able to look at our own data, which will be fabulous. So John, there's a few questions come through. So we'll start with the first. So somebody did ask, how does the fact a patient's had laser refractive surgery affect the choice of IOL power, which lens you would choose?
Okay, so what it does is it messes up the usual calculations, but fortunately, where people have come up with better calculations now. So what we say to patients beforehand is that the fact you've had laser surgery changes the anatomy of the eye such that it's much harder for us to predict accurately what lens to put in. So they just have to, we will do our best. We're using the most up-to-date formulae that are available, but nonetheless, there is a certain vagary to that estimation, and therefore there's a chance that, they may find that glasses are beneficial both for near and for distance. The positive side of having had laser is that usually they've dialed out the corneal astigmatism to some. There's less corneal astigmatism in that, but it does depend how much lenticular astigmatism the patient had, because of course, your residual astigmatism that you would measure during a refraction is a composite of the lenticular astigmatism and the corneal astigmatism. And so when someone's having refractive laser, if they had a lot of lenticular astigmatism, the laser surgeon will have deliberately created compensatory corneal astigmatism. And so sometimes, it's not as happy as the patient would like. And also those patients tend to be the patients who have the highest expectations of healthcare, hence which the thing that drove them, they probably hate glasses. That's what drove them to have the laser in the first place. So it's a bit of a longer conversation, but at the end of the day, we can't fix that. We just have to say, I'm sorry, but we'll do our best, but you may well find that distance and near glasses are beneficial for you following surgery. But we'll try our best not to get you what you want.
Great, thanks for that. So another question specifically about the audit. Can patients access the national audit themselves, and can they see the names of the different surgeons?
Yeah, in fact, if you took these slides off, if I shared screen with you, I could go on the website and search up somebody. You can go, if I do it yourself, if you go to nodaudits.org.uk, and then there's a thing that says for patients, and imagine you're a patient in England or Wales or Northern Ireland. If you're in a participatory centre, you can go and search up the hospital and look at the hospital's complication rates, and you can even look up the individual surgeon if you know which surgeon you're getting. You can't look up trainees, you can only look up consultants, so we do protect the trainees from visibility, but you can look up both the hospital and the surgeon. Currently, that's not super popular with surgeons, actually. Not everyone wants to be looked at by the patients, and so it's in debate as to whether we might move that off so that patients will be able to see that the surgeon's either in the acceptable bracket or in the considering ways to improve bracket. But yeah, anyway, that's probably going to change. We're probably going to remove that facility, but right now you could go and look me up and find out what my complication rate is. I can't remember what it was last year. You can only see my last year. You can't see everything that I can see. If I log in, I can see a lot more data.
Okay,
but yeah,
that's great. Super. Thanks for that. So just another question here. Just with the work that you've done, have you seen, is there any increased risk of later retinal complications with phacodenesis?
Yeah, so if a patient has an already wobbly lens, maybe because the zonules are loose, if you get away with it with the cataract surgery and you manage to get the cataract out and the lens into the bag and then the lens is a bit wobbly, I have seen a reasonable number of patients for whom the bag then fibroses slightly and it pulls on the zonules, and that then can dislocate the lens into the eye. Particularly patients with uveitis, that's a risk. So in such patients, you could put in a capsule tension ring, which is just a ring that kind of pushes out against the bag and tries to hold the capsule in place and take some of the stress off the zonules. Whether that's helpful or not, I don't know. I mean, it does have a certain, it's not a heavy ring, but it increases the weight, so it might increase the wobble. And then it's then difficult to get out of the eye because it pings open to about 12 or 13 millimeters, which has got to be a nuisance. I'm glad I'm not a vitreoretinal surgeon, picking those bits out of the eye.
That sounds very difficult. Okay, so just another question here. What do you, and perhaps this is a question to the whole panel actually, what do you see a solution to long waiting lists, or what do you see is the solution or a solution to long waiting lists? Is it, should more health professionals be trained to do routine cataract surgery? Just making that longer, has English system using private for cataracts, has the English system using private mostly for cataracts been a good thing or a bad thing? So just a general question really about who should be doing surgery.
I mean, I'll probably let John Ellis come in on a bit of that first half of that question, but to take this, the second half, the English experience, I mean, it's really interesting having England and Scotland running. I mean, basically the English allowed in any qualified providers for whatever reason in the 90s under the Labour government at that point, and they said basically we'll provide a certain amount of money. It was like £700 per cataract operation, and it was based on an estimate of how much it cost us in the NHS, where we were normally doing 6 or 7 on a list. So someone did the maths and thought, well, if you pay £700 per cataract, that kind of breaks you even on the sort of staffing levels. But of course, if you are this is the problem here is you can't stop the public sector behaving like the public sector, and you can't stop the private sector behaving like the private sector. So the private sector see this and they think, brilliant, if we can put 12, 14 in a 4-hour list, we're going to be making thousands of pounds of profits on each list, and they are. So the private sector got hold of cataract and has ramped up the efficiency. They're running systems like they are in Tayside, but they're motivated by money and they're making huge amounts of money. But you can't criticize private companies for behaving like private companies. Likewise, the public sector, I'm afraid, I tried to increase the volume. I got to 10 on a list in my hospital, and the nurses all complaining. They're saying, why are you doing this? You're just showing off. Stop it. And I obviously lost the battle for hearts and minds. And I was, after 4 lists, I was becoming the least popular consultant in my department, having been, I would like to think, at least averagely popular-ish before that, or not the least popular anyway. But because they're like, we're having to work twice as hard for no extra pay. We don't want to do this. So I don't know. I think that on the whole, if from a patient's point of view, though, if we remember that patients matter, the patients like the private sector because you get referred, you're seen within a month, you have first eye within 1 month, the second eye in the second month. So in less than 12 weeks, you've had both eyes done. And that's across the board, and it's equitable. They're treating poor people, rich people. They don't care because every patient carries this price tag on top of their heads, and the private sector will whisk you through. My only complaint is that they will put in a slightly cheap intraocular lens, but that's because they'll get you back later and do your YAG laser, and they'll get paid another 180 quid for doing your YAG laser. So, but again, you cannot criticize private companies, that's how they behave. So you just need to create a system. If you want to run that way, you've got to manage the greed. I don't know, I'll let John comment probably.
I'm not sure I've got too much more to add. I mean, I suppose I spent some time talking about, you know, how it is that you get high levels of productivity within the NHS, within the kind of family firm that we all love. The only thing I would say is that when Neil Gray came, I said to him at the final slide of my PowerPoint, I said, we had 3 aims. Can it be done? Can it be sustained? Can it be generalized? I said, we've succeeded at 1 and failed at 2. So we showed it could be done and that we did it. It will not be sustained and it has not been generalized. We've had 11 visits from 9 different health boards around Scotland. And not one of them has been able to reproduce it. And it will die with us. You know, I'm looking at you know, we've crested the top of the mountain and we're going down the other side. And I think this is the stuff of, you know, carrying on after the meeting with a beer in the bar, because it's the deep stuff about human flourishing and morale and what it is that makes people tick. And you know, for a while we were kind of shiny because people were proud of the fact that we were doing more. But twice I've been in changing rooms in a different hospital in another part of Scotland where 2 different clinicians have said to me, I see that you're doing 12 on a list, that the standard list was 7. Why would you do that? You just increase your liability. So from medic to medic, there is the pressure to say, why would you do that when you don't get paid more for it? And I think that's disappointing to hear, because it means really that person is saying, well, when I left school, I was an idealistic 17-year-old. I've kind of lost that now. And that's within the public sector. So, you know, we're into pretty deep territory about what it is that makes people tick, aren't we? You know, what do you do for your patients? But it's interesting, John and I, we've met a couple of times. We never really shared notes, but we're absolutely on the same page. And I think the thing about, you know, your mother-in-law and your mother and yourself and the £1,000 you don't have, I mean, my point has always been that cataract is really a public health measure. It's not really an illness. We're all going to get it. It's not a pathology in that sense. And you have to have a public health strategy for it. And I think we had the 3 things that I presented were direct listing, ISBCS, and I've forgotten the other one, high volume. Right, that's 3. There were 2 more that we tried and aborted. One was to try and task shift, which is to say get non-doctors to do cataract surgery. That is a whole talk in itself, and it blew up in my face. It's kind of why I lost a job. So that's really touching the 3rd rail. And the last one is the one that Scottish Government has tried with the CFSD, that just do one more message. So if you do 5 to 7 on a list and you went up to 6 to 8, that alone, if it's 5,500 lists per year, you can do the maths. So my problem with that is it's the collectivism problem, and that's what I was trying to indirectly allude to, that people don't respond well to people wagging their finger at you saying you should do one more. I think you have to follow the advocacy of people who enjoy it and who do it well. And John actually said in one of his points there that not everyone should necessarily be a cataract surgeon. And I think we're trying to move it into being the, whatever it is, the 11th, 12th or 13th subspecialism. And I think if it's there and some people have systems that will work, maybe that's the way to do it. But I've talked too long, but but whatever's the case, 4 weeks south of the border and 4 years north of the border is a big problem. And I wrote to one of the very high senior Scottish government, didn't get a response, but that's a big problem. So I'm not really answering the solutions thing, but I think we can all agree it's a problem.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks very much. It's quite a complicated issue, but thank you for those. Thank you for those perspectives. I think just with you then as talking about sort of the surgery itself, somebody has actually asked, would you be happy? I guess going back to your pictures, John, of your mum, etc. Would you be happy for a trainee to do either you or your mum's cataract surgery?
Happy? How do we? Happy? I don't aspire to happiness. I think that's a futile chasing after happiness. But so no, I wouldn't be happy for either myself or my mother. Would I go with it? I don't know. We'll see when the time comes. Maybe for one of my eyes, I would. If I was having ISBCS, certainly. And I've done ISBCS, and again, it's. When I started doing ISBCS in Leeds, one of my colleagues burst into my office in the days when we had offices and said, "What you're doing is disgusting," which I thought was a bit strong, because just changing is really difficult. He was saying, "What if they have an infection in both eyes?" And anyway, it's really interesting how different people's perspectives are so different, and so need a level-headed approach. But no, I think probably I wouldn't be happy, but I would do it because I believe in it, and we have to think of what world we want to see, and what is it Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. You have to. I don't know. It's difficult. What about yourself, Helen? Would you? How would
Well,
you feel?
I'm not entirely sure I want to answer that, but what I was going to say was, I think it does show, though, just your little story there of the surgeon saying that was disgusting. It just shows the power of having things like a big data set where you can actually, rather than people's felt reaction to something, and oftentimes that is why people don't do things, because it's fear. But if you actually have the data and you can say, well, actually the PCR rate is this, or the endophthalmitis, I can't say the word, apologies, endophthalmitis rate is X, Y, or Z, and actually it's no different, it suddenly changes, because it's very hard to argue with the actual statistics. And I think that can sometimes help when there's a bit of resistance to change. But I'll just, John's just got his hand up, so I don't know if he wanted to come back in with from that.
You're muted.
Sorry, yeah, just to give my vote on the same thing. Just for comfort, I've got an an ST1 with me now, and I asked her the very first time she's in theatre, hadn't done anything before, and I put the needle through for a suture on a secondary ACIOL anterior lens, and I got out of my seat and I said, please tie that knot, and when she sat back, I said, please tell me you've done that before. She'd never done it before, and I let her do some more things, and I took her aside at the end and I said, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm saying. At my peak, I was never as good as you are now. You've got a phenomenal career ahead of you. And I've watched her do things. And actually, to some extent, this is just a nuance that there are trainees and there are trainees, obviously. I would say two things. One is a really good situation is a trainee with young hands and dexterity with a senior brain beside them. So John sitting beside a really good ST2, ST3, who says, I've seen this before, don't do that. But their fluidity of action is peaking. I mean, I'm getting old now. And second thing I was going to say, to prove that I'm old, I forgot what I was going to say. But yeah, no, it's not coming back to me. So except that we have to let the next generation move up through it, that's for sure. And this is what I was going to say. I think there's a failure of moral courage within the training system. I've had a trainee that I just kind of had to sack off the system, and she was 5 standard deviations off what was acceptable. Uncontroversially, absolutely appalling. And I would have thought it was a relief to her to be told not to operate. And I've never met a more obvious case. It was so easy to do, and I can't tell you how difficult it was made to get someone off the program. And I think the problem is that, and this is where John's data is so helpful, those triangles that were way above, one was 3 standard deviations above. We have got people where Oscar Wilde said, medicine is principally an occupation for the employment of the middle classes. We've got to move away from that. We're not a boys' club to look after each other. We are there for the patients. And if somebody's behavior is out of order and dexterity is just not cutting it, we need a threat-free system of dealing with it. And that's where the power of the nod is so excellent, because it doesn't make it personal. It just says, look, these are the numbers. So I think that cuts in at the senior level, and I think it cuts in at training level too.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John.
If I could just throw one thing, if people think back to my oh, sorry, am I muted? Are you?
No, you're not muted, Karen and John.
Oh, no, okay, but just to say, if you remember the graph with the blue dots on, there were surgeons, the far right-hand side there, in the last audit year, there was 2 surgeons who did more than 7,000 cataracts in 12 months. And I didn't believe them. I didn't believe the data. I thought that's too many. You can't do that many. And I wrote to them, and they did. This is what they did. Because they did 30 a day. And I thought, well, you're going to kill yourself. You're working 6 days a week, but they're not. They're working 5 days a week or 6 days some week. They're doing 30 a day, but they're finished by 4 o'clock and they're home with the kids by 5. It's actually, if you've got a slick system and a good pair of hands, it is doable. And I actually think the one thing that Scotland could learn from England is to look at, if you looked at our graph, you don't need the 2,000 surgeons on the left-hand side of that graph. You just need 20 guys doing 5,000 a year each. And their job is being excellent cataract surgeons. And if those 20 guys will change Scotland and drop your waiting time, and you don't need them for long, because 20 times 5,000 is 100,000. You know, you borrow 20 of our surgeons and you're done.
That sounds great. So just actually while we're on the thinking about the plots, John, that just nicely finishes. It's just kind of really one last question. It's got sort of, it's one person but with two questions, so I'll just put it together if it's all right. Just around the looking at the graph, can we be sure that the outlier surgeons and centres are truly poorer, sort of less good, rather than a statistical anomaly? And then the other point was Service said was just commenting on complication rates and trainees and saying, does the complication rate for trainees look wildly different to the average? But I guess that's dependent on if their data's in the nod. Yeah, no, we don't present, none of those was trainee data. We've kind of hidden that. But yes, their trainees, their data is much worse. They are a risk factor for complications. That's risk adjusted. So with all the other factors, but the fact we know which patients are most likely to have complications means we can remove those from the training pool to some extent. Yes, the statistical anomaly is really important. It's all about sample size. So we don't present data for anyone who does fewer than 50 cataract operations a year. But what is very clear that there's an inflection that if you were doing fewer than 500, or let's say if you do less than 250 cataracts a year, that group of surgeons who are doing less than 250 per year are causing, although they might be doing the same number of cataract. I've got other slides on this. I couldn't put every slide, but basically, if you took all the surgeons and there's about 800 of them doing less than a certain number compared to the 20 highest volume surgeons, they're both doing about 100,000 cataracts a year. But those guys are having like 20 times the complication rate of those guys. So with the same group of patients being referred to NHS for their NHS cataract surgery, the high volume surgeons are outperforming the low volume surgeons incredibly, and that's as a group. So therefore that obliterates the statistical anomaly. So as an individual, you could say, you only did 100, therefore I could be a statistical, like if you roll the dice 5 times, you might get 5 6s and win a car. But that, you know, you can't roll the dice 100 times. You can't roll the dice 1,000 times. That's why with our nod data, that's why I showed the data over 6 years. The 1 year data, yes, you can hide behind the statistics argument. There's no hiding after 5 years of data. This is who you are. And therefore, if you are underserving your patients, then really things need to change. Yeah. Sorry, I was on mute. No, thank you so much. That's just incredibly helpful to sort of understand the dynamics and also the power of the big data and the statistics. So that really is bringing us to the end probably of our question time. I have got a couple more important things just to mention, but I would just say one of the comments, John, to your talk there was that it wasn't a question, but someone just wanted to say it was the best data analysis that they've seen so far this year. So so that's great. So just thank you so much for taking the time to answer all of those questions. If I can just ask Jane to pop us over to the next slide, that would be fantastic. And I've just got a couple of important things to mention. So first of all, it's incredibly helpful for us to get your feedback. We would love to know what you thought of this evening, what was helpful. It's just lovely, especially oftentimes with a big audience like this, when you can't see videos as well. You know, there's no sense of sort of people's reactions, etc. So if you can scan the code, I've done it. It takes between 1 minute and 2 minutes. So if you've got any energy left this evening, we'd appreciate it if you just pop on there and provide that feedback. Helps us to understand if it was useful, and also any ways if we ever did any future things, what can be improved as well. So that would be super, and we'd absolutely really value your response and thoughts. If I can just go to the next slide, Jane. Sorry, thanks. And then really finally, just that little bit of housekeeping. So if you are wanting to claim CPD points from the GOC this evening, then you will be able to go to the learning history section of CHORAS, and within the next 7 days you should be able to download your certificate, and that'll allow you to do that. And then if tonight has whetted your appetite and you're thinking, I absolutely want to now do some more training in cataract surgery, there is a fantastic opportunity from NES. called the Cataract Clinic Experience at Golden Jubilee. It's for optometrists and IP optometrists. It's a half-day experience, and there are still some dates available in June and July. So if you can go, I would, it's be great to get booked onto that, and you can do that booking via Churas. So really, that just remains tonight for me to say thank you. So first of all, an absolute huge thank you to our speakers, to Janet Pooley, to John Ellis and John Buchan. Really appreciate your expertise and just all the insight that you've given us this evening. Thank you so much for your time. And then secondly, a big thank you to Jane Kyle from NEST. She's been behind the scenes tonight, really keeping everything going very smoothly. So big thank you to Jane. And finally, a big thank you for everybody, 167 people who are still online with us this evening. Thank you for participating. Thank you for your questions. And on behalf of us all tonight, we just want to say a big thank you and good night, and take care of yourselves. Bye for now.